the Second World War.
Yes, absolutely. And the visions of peace that those leaders in the West particularly brought forward, a new economic system, a new global economic order, notions of furthering democracy, have been with us for the past 80 years. So it's not just about winning the war, it's also about winning the peace. History shows us that when you get the peace right, it's a lasting peace. When you get the peace wrong, it tends to be over pretty quickly.
That's very chilling to hear that summary from you there when we know the headlines today. Let's just take in some of the sights and sounds. The procession is underway, and it's interesting the timing of it. No one who's left Parliament Square has yet reached Buckingham Palace. It's a reminder of how this procession is moving. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery and the mounted band behind. Now let's have a word about these horses, Apollo and Juno. The famous drum horses lead the band. It's recorded that as early as 1660 the regiment was preceded by its own mounted kettle drummer and 4 trumpeters. They hold the rank of major, these drum horses, the most senior animals in the army. In fact, James is saluting the horses as I speak here. Juno is the first mare to take this role. She weighs nearly a ton, and she has to be ridden along with Apollo, operated with the reins operated by the stirrups, with an adult in full ceremonial uniform, the 2 kettle drums, and Apollo pulled the carriage when the then Duchess of Cornwall visited the farm where both Apollo and Juno are from in Wales. There's Joy again with His Majesty, and to your point, Katie, the King is relaxed with people who basically are of his mother's generation. She a veteran too.
100%, and he will be. Well, obviously we can't hear what they're saying, but he will be listening to these stories. He will be, I think, very keen to meet with many of veterans, of course, some of whom he has met before, and that Buckingham Palace Garden Party that later on will be another opportunity for these stories to be shared and these very important tales to be told and retold. And it makes me think back to those images. And of course, actually, we should also point out the Queen, of course. We talk about the royal family and its links to the military. But of course, Queen Camilla has her own links to the military. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, he served in the Second World War in the Battle of Dunkirk. Indeed, he was a prisoner of war in Germany, and I think one of the times that we see the Queen most moved and deeply affected is when she's meeting with veterans, when she's hearing their stories. And of course, she's Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Lancers, which is her late father's regiment. So that sort of sense of history and connection with the military community runs both through the King and of course his lineage, but also through Queen Camilla too.
James, just the big picture of this ceremonial. Katie's reminded us that this is part of the great patriotism of we British. 10, 20 minutes ago now, Leave Parliament Square is approaching the Queen Victoria Memorial where sits the royal party. There he is. And this tells me by the clock how long this procession is. There will be people at Parliament Square in the detachments that we saw form up who have not yet left, as Otto, carrying the Major General, frisks his head approaching it. Look at him. And there will be a reminder of the three forces, the tri-service cooperation, James. No one is above anyone in recalling how this effort was between all three services.
Absolutely, and just before the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the then General Sir Harold Alexander made the point that the Army, Air Force and Navy must become a brotherhood. And it's indicative, I think, of the fact that Britain is an island nation and that most of the operations in the Second World War were amphibious and required all three services.
King is on his feet, taking as the Major General salutes. King takes the salute because we now know that the front of the procession has reached the monarch, and that's the appropriate moment as the Major General rides by for the King to exchange the salute. James, the ceremonial which you've spoken about with the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery, at the end of the war, how much of a fighting force was the United Kingdom? How ferocious have we become?
Very good, and I think that there's often a sort of narrative that suggests that Britain was somehow sort of hanging on the shirt tails of the Americans and sort of got lucky at various times, but actually it was a very, very proficient armed forces by the end of the Second World War, and really from kind of halfway through the war, I think. You know, on air, in the air, on land, and particularly at sea, Britain was very, very efficient, ruthless, and protracted the war with enormous efficiency, I would say.
I mentioned it's a tri-service victory on Victory in Europe Day, but let me go through the services before we leave viewers later on this afternoon. Some of the key moments in the army in the World War II, a difficult question, but what would come to mind?
Well, I would say the successful evacuation of Dunkirk. Of course, that was part down to the Air Force and the Navy as well, but a very well organised retreat. Obviously, Alamein is a big turning point. That's the first time that a British army defeats absolutely emphatically an Axis forces in the field. Or German forces, I would say, as well as Italian. But there's a whole host of key moments. I suppose the victory in Tunisia, bigger in terms of troops and material losses than the Germans suffered at Stalingrad. That took place in May 1943. Then you've got the invasion of Sicily, the invasion of Italy, the capture of Rome on 4th June 1944, of course D-Day, and the performance they played in Operation Market Garden, the ultimately unsuccessful but still heroic effort to make a breakthrough into Germany in September 1944. Operation Veritable in February 1945, crossing into the Reichswald on the western edge of Germany and through the city of Cleve. A huge operation. Britain was there for the long run, and the British Army had to grow exponentially from after the defeat of France in June 1940, a very, very small army in 1939, and had to grow to a huge extent. I mean, there were 85 raised divisions. A division was a unit by which we judge armies in the Second World War. If you imagine about 15,000 men, that's not far off, give or take. It was a huge commitment. And by 1945, the British Army was exceptionally good. 75% conscripts, well armed, well led, and performed immensely courageously.
And again, we can't resist taking a look at the Wales children, and I think this will be a very important moment for them. Of course, we've seen them at important occasions. I think most recently, I think people will remember seeing the three children at the coronation. Look at Prince George there. I mean, he was only 9 when his grandfather was crowned. He had that very important role as master page to the king. He is witnessing these historical moments unfold, and I suppose with a level of understanding that one day it's going to be him being head of the armed forces, of course his father before that. But this all feels very much like tutelage from a very young age, that very important sense of learning, and he's learning by witnessing, learning by watching these moments, understanding a very important connection between his family and the family of veterans, the military family, which is so connected with the royal family.
Scotland the Brave, let's listen in to the pipes and drums. Now, just behind the pipes and drums, we're looking at the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, a historic organisation, one of the most decorated female units in the world, and there they are, major contribution to the war in the field. They worked mainly in France. They're walking shortly towards the Women in the War monument. And James, it seems this must be the time as they look to the cenotaph and shortly reach the Women in the War memorial on Whitehall, to ask you of the role of women, both on the home front and in service.
Well, it was actually huge. By June 1944, at the time of D-Day, there were 467,000 women in uniform and a further 1.635 million working in the armaments industry, which represented about a third of the workforce. So a huge contribution. Over 73,000 Wrens in the Navy, 199,000 in the Army, 174,000 in the RAF, and 19,500 nursing, of which about 6,000 were fannies. And of course, of the 50 women that were sent to France as couriers and agents, 39 of them were fannies.